I'm ready to go.
So good evening, everyone, including guests in the gallery. My name is Shirley Wilson, and I am the chair of the Abbotsford Board of Education. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the 2025 budget consultation, where we invite your feedback, but not until you've heard from our Secretary Treasurer Ray Bellistuck. Today, we are gathered on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Stolo people, of particularly the Mathwe and Sumac First Nations, who were the original caretakers of this land. We welcome you here to join us for this very important work. I'd also like to note that our District Parent Advisory Chair is Shannon Rose has joined us today, also to hear what it is that we are talking about, more so what Mr. Bellistuck is talking about. Over to you, Mr. Bellistuck.
You. Share my screen. So I'm going to go through this rather quickly, and this information will be on our engagement portal. It'll be on the district website as well for people who want additional information. So the first thing I'm just going to highlight is our budget calendar. It outlines the major milestones that we have as we move through the budget development process, culminating in the budget approval on June 17th. The budget and our updating strategic plan is an ongoing cycle, and so there's various phases that we're in at a number of different times. So we're in the planning and actually in the preparation phase right now. It looks like the evaluation phase of the cycle is a little bit later on, but we're also in the process of evaluating our current year budget to see how accurate that is, and we'll be making forecasts that influence the budget for next year. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. The budget is based on some guiding principles established by the board, and the board reconfirmed these guiding principles this past December. I'm not going to read them, but they've been in place for a number of years, and they really talk about some fundamentals on which we build a budget and make sure that we're communicating information and that we set the district up for long-term financial success. And that enables the board to achieve its strategic goals, in light of all the different financial and budget pressures that we face on an ongoing basis. So I just want to highlight some information about the Ministry of Education's budget and also a little bit about the overall provincial budget this year. The ministry K-12 budget is just under $9 billion. You can see a number of areas where there were changes and some increases in funding to the Ministry of Education's budget this year. None of these are shocking. We kind of anticipated these changes, that there'd be money to cover the cost of living adjustments from the shared recovery mandate that was announced last April. And then there's some additional funds for the Classroom Enhancement Fund. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Classroom Enhancement Fund later on in the presentation. Some highlights provincially is just some areas that of note. One is that the province has a $4 billion contingency in the budget for the coming year and for the following 2 years as well. So over that 3-year plan, they've got $4 billion in each of the years to pay for things that are unforeseen. So when they have unforeseen events like forest fires and floods and things that are outside of what would be considered the normal operations, that's what contingencies are for. Those contingencies also are set up to support any bargaining mandates, and broader public service will be negotiating collective agreements this year. And so those contingencies at this point are set up to manage any of the mandates that are set for bargaining. There's also over the 3-year plan, $1.5 billion set aside for expenditure management, which means when you look at the provincial budget, it's a negative amount in the budget of $300 million for this year, and then $600 million for the next 2 years, that are ways that the government is trying to reduce spending. So they're going to be at some point, I presume, talking to the ministries across the province about how do we recover $300 million in the current year from various ministries. So you've already heard government has announced a hiring freeze, and they'll recover some funds from doing things like that. This is akin to what we had in 2013, 14, 15, when we had administrative savings plans. I don't think it's going to be, at this point anyways, quite that extreme. And this money isn't targeted for education, it's targeted to the broad public sector. So there's lots of places that they can look to recover some costs. Just an area to pay attention to in light of the current economic situation we have with, pending tariffs and things like that. So we work really hard to align all of the budget work we do with the board's strategic plan built around the 4 strategic pillars that we have. Those pillars support 17 different main objectives that the district has related to primarily in our number 1 pillar around student success, and you can see the objectives there around student literacy and numeracy and things like that. Also, the other pillars, a number of objectives that staff report on throughout the year related to how we're implementing the board's overall strategic plan across the district. So in the coming year, these items aren't going to change for 25-26. The board is committed to see these continue and for staff to continue to work on making improvements in each of these goal areas. The board also last year in our budget approval had listed these, and it says 24-25 priorities. So these are the top priorities the board sets. So literacy obviously is the number 1 priority, but those are the top 5 priorities the board had rated last year in development of the budget. So in the current school year, 24-25, the board just approved its amended budget. So we do a preliminary budget and have it approved in June for the coming school year, and our fiscal period runs July to June. So that budget is in place. The revenue estimates in those budgets are based on September enrollment projections. And when those actual September enrollments come in, the ministry funds what those actual enrollments are. So in most cases, it means that districts have adjustments to their revenues based on what those actual enrollments are. And then the ministry requires boards to submit an amended budget. So those amended budgets were submitted, and I think the board did ours in February this year. And that amended budget had a projected deficit of just under $1.7 million in the current year. So that would reduce the board's overall accumulated surplus by $1.7 million. But as we begin to work on the budget, and we'll be updating our forecast in the current year, so that we have the best reflection of what our budget numbers look like, we expect that $1.7 million deficit to actually be more like a $1 million surplus. So instead of removing money from the surplus, they'll have the effect of increasing the accumulated surplus. So about that accumulated surplus, and I met with Deepak a week or so ago and talked a little bit about accumulated surplus, but it is obviously the fund that we board sets aside for unforeseen expenditures, things that aren't ongoing regular operating costs, but things that are unavoidable expenditures that occur during the year that have to be funded. And so that is why there's an accumulated surplus. It's also there to help the board fund any projects they have. So we have a pretty successful technology program in the district. And I would say that that would be envious of most districts. And, every 4 years, we replace all of our end user equipment. So that's planned for this summer. And you need to be able to have reserves set aside so that you can afford to do some of those things. And it's just all about good planning. And the board has been, really supportive in ensuring that we're able to do that work on an ongoing basis. So one of the things our board's administrative procedure has around accumulated surplus is some targets around the unrestricted surplus. And the unrestricted one is what we would use to fund that $1.7 million projected deficit. It's not targeted for anything. It's not a reserve set aside for technology or a reserve set aside for school budget carry forwards. It has no particular use, but the targets the board has is between 2.4 and 7.3 million. And this year we were around 5.4 million. 5.6 million, pardon me. So this is what our accumulated surplus looked like at the end of the 23-24 school year. There's a number of different categories there. The $529,000 item is primarily for our Indigenous carry forwards. It's targeted money. It can only be spent on that one thing. And it's a condition of the funds. So that is internally restricted due to constraints on the funds. The board also restricts other funds. The next one is that for future operations, that is mainly school budget carry forwards. So we allow our schools, if they don't spend all of their budget money in one given year, to carry it forward to a future year. That's what that money is for. The next one is for those projects and things like that, for technology reserves, for future spending that the board has planned. And then the unrestricted surplus of 5.6, leaving the whole accumulated surplus with a balance of 8.7. So I like to do this every year because I think it's important to know how our spending compares to the rest of the province and some districts of similar size, just so that we have a sense of, are we in the ballpark, in the sector and within our comparator group in terms of how money is spent. And I don't get too hung up on any of the specifics of this, if it's a certain percent or, I just generally want to look and see if where we sit, and can we explain sometimes some of the changes that we might see. So on the instruction side, you can see that in Abbotsford we spend more than the provincial average in instruction. You can see where a number of districts around us spend. I would say that in the last number of years, we've been one of those higher districts in terms of instruction. And this year, this number, or in 23-24, this number dropped down. So the numbers you're looking at right now are based on the 23-24 financial statements from school districts. So it's based on actual information. So typically we've been a little bit higher in this area. And I would say that if you look at this one, district administration, it's a little bit higher. We're still below the provincial average. But our district administration costs last year were a little bit higher than they typically have been. We've often been one of the lower ones in terms of this. But one of the expenditures the district has in 23-24 and in 24-25 are costs related to our ERP implementation. So the board approved that project over a year ago, and we're in the process of implementing our new payroll financial system, HR system, to support the district in the long term. So that's why we've seen some of our district administration costs escalate. I would think that in a future year, this number would return back to its typical position. Operations and maintenance, and again, this is an area where we're very efficient in terms of the cost of operating our school buildings. We typically are one of the lower districts in terms of the total cost per square meter, and other metrics that we might look at. Our utility costs are managed pretty aggressively. So every time that we're able to save money in one of these areas, it allows us to spend a little bit more someplace else. And that area often is our instructional area. So it's important for us to always, just maintain an understanding of where our spending is relative to all the other areas of spending in the district, and make sure that we're within the general area of spending in all these comparative ones too. It's good to look and think, how do we spend relative to some other districts, to see if how our operations compare and if we're in the ballpark kind of thing. So transportation, this is one where I'd tell you we're less in the ballpark. It's an area where our transportation costs exceed the provincial average, and Abbotsford's a unique community in that it's got some rural areas and it's got some urban areas. But its transportation is a cost that I think we're going to have to monitor really closely going forward. I've been saying that for a couple of years, but this line keeps increasing. We're over 2% of total expenditures now, and just an area that for us to really pay attention to as our population grows, and its population is growing within the city, and we're providing a lot of transportation within the boundaries of the city. So it's with limited assets to move people around. We don't get funded for buses that often in this district because we're not a huge rural district that gets funding, and there is no ministry funding for transportation, although they will fund school buses when a bus becomes ages out, if you will. But there's no provincial operating funds to fund the costs related to student transportation. So this is just a picture of how every dollar gets spent in the district. Just under 60 cents of every dollar is spent on teacher salaries and benefits. And you can see all the other categories that exist, and we pull them out and just to look at different areas. Like 10 cents of every dollar spent on building operations, whether it's managing custodial or utility costs or things like that. So you get a picture of how money is spent in the district. You wouldn't be surprised to see that teachers is by far our single biggest expenditure. So I'm going to talk about budget pressures in general, but I wanted to highlight some budget pressures that we see provincially before I get into what Abbotsford's picture looks like. But when we look at the last changes over the last 5 years, the cumulative change in provincial expenditures, and we look at all the major categories of spending that we have, whether it's teachers or education assistants or support staff. And then you look across, you notice one set of bars that just are much higher than the others. And that's related to substitute employee costs. That is an area of concern. It's risen 88% over the 5-year period, starting going back to 2019-20 school year. So we've seen across the province a pretty significant increase in substitute employee costs. That's about $140 million. I highlight that because when we look at all those other areas of salaries to the left of substitutes, those are all funded by the province for the most part. Salary increases that are approved in collective agreements or that are funded by the province are in those numbers. So you see the costs increase over time. Those all reflect the or those all are funded by the ministry. So whether it is funded because of a wage increase or funded because enrollment has increased and we've added additional staff, all of those categories generally have funding attached to them. Substitute employee costs do not. So that $140 million is being borne by districts across the province, and you're starting to see districts say, holy cow, we're running short of money. We have to make some changes in our spending because we have, whether it's inflationary factors or things like rising costs that are not funded that they have to deal with. So employee benefits on this list, for the most part, would be funded as well. Supplies and services, you know, we've always complained about. That's where the inflationary factors are, and they're not funded either. So there are some things that cause significant pressure across the province. This is what it looks like in our school district. So we go back to 2021, we were spending less than $5 million on substitute employee costs. This year, our budget is $9.2 million. So over that time frame, we've increased over $4 million in those costs. Our budget estimates for 25-26 right now, we've set it about $10 million. And which is, you know, it's going to be double what it was in 2021. But we actually haven't seen the same increases that other districts around the province have seen in this area. If we get to 10 million, we will. But it's an area we're watching really closely, and you can see our changes from 21, 22 to 22, 23, and then 23, 24. We were pretty flat through those years. And other districts, if I go back to this chart, you can see that they weren't. They were increasing each of those years, many districts. So whether it's some of the programs we have in place, or I'm not sure what it was that caused us not to escalate at the same cost as those districts, but we're starting to see this year some of that change. So hopefully our costs won't hit our $9.2 million estimate. That'll help reduce our estimate for a future year likely as well. But it is an area that we're watching really close. I mentioned I was going to talk about the Classroom Enhancement Fund, and that's the fund that government set aside to fund the teacher collective agreement costs related to class size and composition. We'll just call it CEF because we love acronyms in public education. So I just wanted to share a number of things, and all of these are defendable because I'm going to give you some examples of these 4 districts, including Abbotsford, and just talk about why these conditions exist. So this is the amount of Classroom Enhancement Fund money that each of these school districts get. And in those bars, I've included the enrollment. So in Abbotsford, in the 24-25 CEF funding, we have 20,692 students. Chilliwack, for what would appear to be a very similar amount of funding, has 15,845 students. Richmond, at just over 23,000 students, has $50 million in funding, and Langley, with almost 26,000 students, has $60 million in funding. So we're not that far off in terms of overall enrollments, but you see what happens with this fund. And this fund is based on the collective agreements that are in place in each of these districts, but it results in the difference in the number of teachers that districts can hire. So in Abbotsford, we have 168 teachers hired under the Classroom Enhancement Fund under our class size composition language. Chilliwack, for having 5,000 fewer students than us, has 182 students. But then you see Langley with 449 extra teachers. So these are teachers that are in place. So I just bring that to your attention. It's a fund that started out as $300 or $400 million provincially. It's grown to almost $1 billion now. And it's, just one of the things that, I've often wondered about the equity around funding, even though that's what the collective agreement language says, the equity around the funding for students in these different districts. Okay, so specifically our budget, we're building our 25-26 budget today. This afternoon, we received our operating grant information from the ministry, so the finance department. Over the next few days, we'll be looking at the operating grant and looking to see if it meets the expectations that we had. Right off the quick glance says, yes, it did, that the things that we had anticipated to be funded and that are in that we expected to see in the operating grant are in the grant. We budgeted for 137 additional students for next year. And we also expect, one of the other assumptions that we have is that Classroom Enhancement Fund would be fully funded by the province. So we believe we need another teacher that is responding to a school's class size composition needs. And we believe that we should apply under the Classroom Enhancement Fund for them. We expect that the province would fund that CEF teacher. So we're not planning on any major service or programming changes in the budget at this point. But these are the major assumptions that we have going into next year. Now, some of the budget pressures that we have, and obviously we have to respond to budget pressures. First off, we're expecting a decline in our international student population. We're still trying to find that number, but initially we've estimated a $1.5 million loss of revenue related to international student declines. That's about 20% decline in our student population. We'll have a $1.5 million increase in our teacher salaries that relates to increments. So teachers are on a salary scale, and as they move up the salary grid, those increments, as they move up the grid, are not funded by the province. So it's an incremental cost that districts have to absorb. The inflationary pressures that we will be able to fund in the budget are things like utilities and bus fuel, the costs that we're going to have to deal with, and regardless of having funding. So we don't have a choice in paying for bus fuel, whatever the fuel costs. The same with utilities, the same with WorkSafe BC premiums, those kind of things. We won't be adjusting any discretionary budgets for inflationary costs. So in a lot of ways, we haven't done that for years. So in a lot of ways, budgets where there's discretionary spending, where a school has got a budget to buy supplies and have teacher training or staff training, some of those budgets essentially are shrinking because of inflation. But that's just the nature of where we're at. We're gonna budget for an additional $800,000 in substitute employee costs for 25-26, unless we see the cost in the current year come down from what the current expectations are. Our employee benefit costs are expected to increase by $600,000. And that is not a funded area at this point in time, but we just see increasing utilization of our benefit plans as well, and that does result in cost increase to the district. Like I mentioned before, we will be refreshing all of our IT equipment this coming summer. We typically have enough in our plan to refresh all that equipment, but we will set aside some additional resources in next year's budget to assist with any supplemental costs that we have. There's always, additional costs related to, we need to put some additional Wi-Fi equipment in a school or, things like that always creep up. So it's good to have essentially a contingency fund to help work through the technology refresh that we have for this coming summer. Continue to have recruitment challenges in our teachers and our education assistant categories. In bus drivers, we've been canceling buses in the last 3 or 4 weeks. It was almost every day there for a couple of weeks where we were canceling 1 or 2 routes, just due to lack of available drivers. So it's an ongoing challenge around recruitment. And again, another pressure is around student transportation, and whether it is the increasing cost of student transportation or it's the demands for service where we simply don't have enough buses and the ministry doesn't fund us for new buses and new routes. So it's just trying to manage the expectations with the existing resources that we have. So here's the picture of the 24-25. I haven't given you any detail on this. This fits better on a slide, but there is detail behind this, obviously. So $1.68 million deficit in the current year was the budget. We forecast that to be a bit better than that number, changing that accumulated surplus at the end of the year to $9.7 million. And then you can see that $5.6 million potential projected deficit that we have, looking at all of those cost pressures. But keep in mind, we haven't refined those pressures yet. So we haven't completely refined the international decline yet. We haven't completely refined that substitute employee cost estimate yet. So there's still some work to do in finishing and making those estimates as close to what we expect as possible. And I would expect that 5.65 number will get better over time. And even if we have to rely on surplus, so we don't have to cut $5.6 million out of our budget in one particular year, that is why we have an accumulated surplus, is so that we can be thoughtful and plan over the next 2 or 3 years how we might manage with what might be limited resources and what might be ministry savings plans and a whole bunch of things like that. But having some accumulated surplus set aside will enable us not to be so reactionary when it comes to having to deal with any of those potential costs that creep up. So I think we're in a pretty good position, and I would guess that after we come back from spring break and the board's April board meeting, you'll see a refined estimate around what we really think that the financial picture looks like in the district. Part of our process also is to consider the risks related to the budget. And so we'll be looking at all of these items like we do every year to determine if we have evaluated all the risks, if we've got contingency set aside for ones that we think might occur, if we're doing the right work in some of these areas to make sure we can try to avoid risks and things like that. So this is part of the budget process that we have every year. So our budget engagement portal will be active after tonight's meeting, where people can go and see this presentation, see some other financial information, participate in our survey. We'll be meeting with our IEC soon to hear about their budget plans and to share some of the plans about the district's budget. There's another public information meeting in May as well, and that'll be the time to talk about, here's what the budget looks like, here are the budget reductions we've had to make, or whatever that might look like. And so that we'll be able to share that information at that time. And back to the calendar. So you can see the dates we have planned in April. Finance Committee will be reviewing a lot of information at the April Finance Committee and at the April board meeting. That's where the bulk of information will be presented to the board for their review. So I'll take any questions.
And while we're waiting for questions, I do want to acknowledge that online we do have Superintendent Sean Nosek joining us today, as well as Vice Chair Preet Rai, Trustee Ruby Kandia Rajwan, and I'm not sure, do we have any other trustees online? I do know that Trustee Peterson sent regrets. And of course, Trustee Corky Neufeld is on leave. So I did want to articulate that, and this is the beginning of our engagement piece. You'll see a video coming out tomorrow requesting input, and we really do, given the type of year that we have coming up, we really do want the public's input. So back to now to, are there any questions? So do online or in here? Ms. Rose?
I have two. International students, we've kind of been declining the last few years, haven't we?
We went up this year.
Oh, we did. Okay, that was gonna be my question. What was the decline this year?
Yeah.
Second, what do we do with all the old technology when we replace it all? Do
We
we
lease
sell that?
most of our end user equipment, so
Oh, okay.
it goes back to. And that's actually what enables us to keep the
Renew.
equipment fresh. Schools have a hard time actually when it comes to our program, to see that this computer is going back to the leasing company and we're gonna replace it. Because they think, well, it works fine, can I keep it? Because, you know, we'll just double the number of computers in the school. But it doesn't fit within our overall plan. It's not cost effective to do that. We have an IT department that is, I think, 17 or 18 people. Langley, well, we're similar to Langley. I always use us and Langley as a comparison. We used to have 4 years ago, almost the same enrollment, and they've just had explosive growth in the last 3 or 4 years. They have 32 people or something in their IT department. We have 17. The reason we can have fewer people in our IT department is that our equipment isn't on the break fix cycle because it's 6, 7, 8 years old. Our equipment is refreshed regularly. We have considerable number of devices, but we have some structure around that, and it's hard to be disciplined, to stay disciplined to that. But this is our 4th time we've gone through a refresh, and like I say, we've been able to continue to do the refresh because we've been true to our initial plan.
That was my question
Okay.
here about technology is, like I know the computer laptops are different, but any desktops that we have, is there an opportunity for, I know it has to be wiped because of privacy reasons, for that to be donated to certain schools that have computer classes? I know we have, this is the first year we have, computer classes at ATS. So one of the things that the teacher's trying to do is he wants to teach these kids how to take these computers apart and how to put them together to teach them that skill. But he just happened to be sharing that with his class, and my son mentioned it to us. My husband works in a computer company, so I said to him, like, you guys are throwing these away, recycling them all the time anyways. Are you able to donate it to the school? So he's working with his work to donate that to ATS, so the kids can have shared computers. Maybe we can even get 12 so they can share to learn how to take them apart, understand it, and put them back together. So if there's any like that are desktop computers that can be recycled.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many desktops we have. We have some. We rely on a lot of mobile devices and you know, smaller Winbooks and things like that are portable. But for sure, we do donate sometimes because we do buy some equipment. It's not all part of a big lease. There's some equipment that we do buy. So it also goes through a planned refresh. So there's opportunity. We do donate devices to third parties. You know, it's been more often than not, I think that we've donated, especially during COVID. We had, and a lot of the surplus equipment that we maybe had on hand at that point in time, we donated a lot of that to third parties.
Any questions online? None? And no more from here? Do you have a question?
Could be taken offline.
Okay, I'll let. All right. I think that wraps us for this evening, and the portal is open.
We will be open, and let us know if you have any more questions.
Okay, thank you.